At 9:50 p.m. on January 31, 2026, Tomaso Chion says he drove 84-year-old Nancy Guthrie home after dinner. The drive was short, about 4 miles across Tucson. He later told investigators he watched her walk inside, saw the garage door close behind her, and left. 14 hours later, Nancy's daughter Annie called 911 to report her missing. That timeline has been public for months. Most people saw it as another tragic disappearance involving an elderly woman living alone. But recently, investigators and reporters started looking at something else entirely, not the porch camera footage, not the pacemaker data, but the financial trail forming quietly behind the case. And once that timeline appears, the story starts feeling very different. Because sometime before Nancy vanished, reports surfaced claiming Annie had asked her mother for a loan. Nancy reportedly said no. Around 8 months before the disappearance, Tomaso had also signed a durable power of attorney, giving Annie authority over financial and property matters. Legal experts said the document itself may have been routine, but the timing raised questions investigators haven't been able to ignore. Then there's everything that followed. Why did the FBI reportedly keep Annie's Honda CR-V for more than 40 days? Modern vehicles can store GPS routes, door activity, and telemetry data. If the timeline was simple, why did investigators need that long? And why has Annie's 911 call never been released? In Arizona, those recordings are usually public. Yet months later, this one remains sealed. The deeper this case goes, the less it feels like a random disappearance, and the more it starts looking like a sequence. Before we go further, tell me this in the comments. What part of this timeline feels the strangest to you? Because when investigators started placing every event side by side, one after another, that's when the story stops looking random. Before Nancy Guthrie became the center of a federal investigation, she was simply an 84-year-old woman living a quiet life in the Catalina foothills of Tucson, Arizona. Friends from church described her as deeply routine-oriented. Every Sunday morning, she attended service without fail, the same seat, the same familiar faces, the kind of person whose absence would be noticed immediately. And that detail matters more than people realize, because on the morning of February 1st, 2026, it wasn't technology that first raised alarm bells. It was a church friend, noticing Nancy was missing from a live stream she never skipped. For decades, Nancy had lived in the same home, tucked into one of Tucson's most desirable neighborhoods. The house was worth close to $1 million, according to public estimates. But people who knew her say she didn't live like someone obsessed with wealth. She gardened. She kept to herself. She spent evenings quietly at home. Her routines were predictable in the way many elderly people's routines become predictable after years of living alone. But underneath that calm routine were signs of growing vulnerability. Nancy had a pacemaker regulating her heart. Every night around 10 p.m., she reportedly took medication that family members knew was important for her health. Before going to sleep, she removed her hearing aids. Once those came out, she was effectively deaf to the world around her. No footsteps outside, no voices, no breaking glass, nothing. And by early 2026, she was living completely alone. Her family dog had died sometime before the disappearance. There was no replacement. The home security camera system existed, but reports suggested the subscription had lapsed, meaning the cameras were no longer actively recording. There was no overnight caregiver, no medical alert pendant around her neck, no monitored alarm system connected to emergency dispatch. An 84-year-old woman, living alone, in $1 million home, with limited hearing, a heart condition, and no active layer of protection between herself and whoever might approach that house after dark. That's the part of this story many people can stop thinking about, because none of those safeguards were financially out of reach. A basic monitored alarm system costs less than a cable bill. A medical alert device can be installed in a day. Even occasional overnight assistance would have been manageable for a family with significant resources. Savannah Guthrie, Nancy's daughter, was already one of the most recognizable television personalities in America. By every public measure, the family had the means to create layers of protection around Nancy's daily life. But somehow, those layers never appeared, and maybe that alone means nothing. Families are complicated. Elderly parents often insist on independence. Adult children convince themselves everything is still fine because admitting otherwise feels painful. In interviews after similar cases, investigators have often pointed out that neglect can grow slowly, almost invisibly, until something finally breaks. But in this case, the absence of protection created something else too. It created opportunity. Because when investigators later reconstructed the final hours before Nancy vanished, they realized something chilling. Whoever came to that house would likely have known exactly how exposed she was. They would have known she was alone. They would have known she could hear them once her hearing aids were removed. They would have known nobody was likely to check on her until morning. And once you understand how vulnerable Nancy really was, a harder question begins to emerge beneath the timeline. Was that negligence or something more dangerous? The deeper investigators looked into Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, the more the case began drifting away from the idea of a random intruder. Not because of a single piece of evidence, but because of a sequence that kept pointing back toward money, access, and timing. That sequence appears to begin in May of 2025. 8 months before Nancy vanished, Tomaso Chion signed a durable power of attorney naming Annie Guthrie as his agent over financial and property matters. When the document first surfaced online, several legal professionals quickly pushed back against conspiracy theories surrounding it. In real estate transactions, refinancing, or shared property management, documents like these can be completely routine, and they rewrite, by itself. The power of attorney proves nothing, but investigators rarely look at documents in isolation. They look at chronology. What happened before it? What happened after it? And whether a pattern starts forming once multiple events are stacked together. Because sometime after that document was signed, and before Nancy disappeared, another report surfaced that changed the tone of the conversation around this case entirely. A publication called Hayden Times claimed Annie had asked her mother for a loan in the weeks leading up to the disappearance. According to the report, Nancy said no. Now it's important to be precise here. Law enforcement has not publicly confirmed that claim. The exact amount of the loan was never released. The reason for the request remains unclear, and no official document has surfaced proving the conversation happened exactly as reported. But even unconfirmed claims can become significant when they align with an existing timeline investigators are already studying, because suddenly the story had something it didn't have before, a possible point of friction, a refusal. And once that possibility entered the public narrative, people began re-examining everything through a different lens. Nancy's home in Tucson's Catalina foothills was estimated to be worth around $1 million. It was the product of decades of ownership in one of the city's most desirable neighborhoods. Annie and Tomaso home, located only a few miles away, was valued significantly lower, around $650,000 according to public estimates discussed online. On its own, that gap means absolutely nothing. Parents often accumulate more wealth than their children over time. That's normal. But in investigations involving elderly victims, detectives frequently look at one question first: who had proximity to the assets? Not necessarily who was wealthy or poor, not who was desperate, simply who had access. And in this case, Nancy's life had become increasingly vulnerable at exactly the same time she was living alone inside one of the most valuable properties connected to the family. That's where the emotional tone of the story begins to shift, because no stops sounding like a simple answer to a financial request. It starts sounding symbolic, a boundary, a denial, a moment people later revisit over and over, searching for meaning. Friends close to similar cases have often described this phenomenon afterward, how one ordinary conversation suddenly becomes loaded with significance only after tragedy strikes. A sentence nobody would have remembered becomes the sentence everyone remembers. And maybe that is exactly what happened here. Maybe the reported loan refusal had nothing to do with Nancy's disappearance at all. But if investigators were already examining financial records, property relationships, vehicle telemetry, and family timelines, then the claim could simply be ignored either. Because now the timeline looked different. May 2025, the power of attorney. Weeks before the disappearance, the reported loan request. An elderly woman living alone in a valuable home with almost no active protections around her. And then, on the night of January 31st, 2026, Nancy Guthrie got into an Uber and went to dinner with Annie and Tomaso. Then came the dinner on January 31st. On the evening of January 31st, 2026, Nancy Guthrie requested an Uber from her Tucson home at approximately 5:32 p.m. Unlike many parts of this case, that portion of the timeline is clean and documented. Rideshare records confirmed the pickup. The driver later cooperated with investigators. The route placed Nancy traveling roughly 4 miles to the home of her daughter Annie and son-in-law Tomaso Chion. That dinner would become the last confirmed social interaction of Nancy Guthrie's life. At first glance, the evening sounded completely ordinary. Family dinner, games, conversation. A quiet Saturday night between relatives who lived close to one another. But as investigators later reconstructed the timeline, The normalcy of that dinner became part of what made it so unsettling. Because by then, according to reports circulating around the case, Nancy may have already refused Annie's request for financial help. And that changes how people hear silence. Nobody outside that house knows what was discussed over dinner that night. Nobody knows whether money ever came up again. There are no recordings, no witnesses sitting at the table. Maybe the evening was warm and relaxed. Maybe there was tension nobody else could see. Families carry complicated emotions all the time without outsiders noticing anything unusual. But investigators don't just study actions, they study atmosphere. They ask whether emotional pressure existed before a critical event, whether relationships had quietly shifted underneath ordinary routines. And after dinner ended, the timeline becomes much narrower. At approximately 9:50 p.m., Tomaso Chion drove Nancy home. Unlike the Uber trip earlier in the evening, this ride left behind no third-party documentation. No app data, no independent timestamp, no outside witness publicly confirmed seeing Nancy arrive home safely. According to Tomaso's account, he walked Nancy inside, watched the garage door close, and then left. If that account is accurate, Tomaso was the last known person to see Nancy Guthrie alive, and for investigators, that fact automatically matters whether foul play is involved or not. In nearly every missing persons investigation, detectives focus intensely on the final verified interaction because it establishes the last stable point in the timeline. What happened after 9:50 p.m. is where the case starts becoming difficult to explain, because from the moment Nancy arrived home until the following afternoon, an enormous window of silence opened around her. No calls from Annie, no text messages, no overnight check-in, no morning follow-up, nothing by itself. That might not sound unusual. Adult children don't always call elderly parents every night, but investigators later viewed that silence through the context of Nancy's vulnerability. Everyone close to her knew the conditions of her life. They knew she removed her hearing aids before bed. They knew she relied on medication. They knew she lived alone in a house without active monitored security. And according to the public timeline, nobody attempted contact for more than 14 hours. That detail became even more disturbing once the overnight evidence started emerging. At approximately 1:47 a.m. on February 1st, Nancy's doorbell camera reportedly captured a masked individual near the home. Shortly afterward, the camera stopped recording. Around the same period, data from Nancy's pacemaker allegedly showed an acute stress response, a spike suggesting fear, exertion, or physical distress. Then came the detail investigators reportedly viewed as one of the most important timestamps in the entire case. At approximately 2:28 a.m., Nancy's pacemaker lost connection with its in-home monitoring unit. That matters because the disconnect may suggest movement. If investigators interpreted the data correctly, Nancy's heart was still active when the connection was lost, meaning whoever removed her from proximity to the monitoring device may have done so while she was still alive. That possibility transformed the case from a missing persons investigation into something much darker. And suddenly, every unanswered question around the timeline became more urgent. Who was the masked figure on the camera? Why did the recording stop? What happened between the stress event and the pacemaker disconnect? And if Tomaso's account of the drive home was straightforward, why did investigators later spend such extraordinary time examining Annie's Honda CR-V? Because modern vehicles don't simply transport people anymore. They remember things: GPS routes, ignition cycles, door openings, speed changes, location history. If investigators believed the official timeline was incomplete, the vehicle itself could potentially reveal gaps no interview ever would. At 12:03 p.m. the following afternoon, Annie Guthrie finally called 911. But even that moment created new mysteries instead of answers. Why was there reportedly a gap between arriving at Nancy's home and making the emergency call? And why, months later, was the 911 recording still sealed from public release? Investigators rarely withhold evidence without a reason. And then investigators took Annie's vehicle. When federal investigators seized Annie Guthrie's Honda CR-V, most people assumed it was routine. In major missing persons cases, vehicles are often processed quickly. Detectives collect fibers, fingerprints, possible biological traces, then release the car within days, sometimes even hours. But this vehicle reportedly stayed with investigators for more than 40 days. That detail changed the tone of the case almost overnight, because 40 days suggests one of two possibilities. Either investigators discovered evidence requiring extended forensic analysis, or the digital data inside the vehicle wasn't aligning cleanly with the timeline they had been given. Modern vehicles are no longer simple machines. They are rolling computers. Many newer models can record route history, ignition cycles, speed patterns, door activity, Bluetooth connections, braking events, and time-stamped movement data. Investigators can sometimes reconstruct an entire evening minute by minute without relying solely on witness memory. Which means if Tomaso's account was accurate, drive Nancy home, watch her enter safely, return directly afterward. Telemetry data could potentially support that quickly. So why keep the vehicle for more than a month? That question became even heavier once attention shifted toward the 911 call. According to the public timeline, Annie arrived at Nancy's home around 11:56 a.m. on February 1st. The 911 call was reportedly placed at 12:03 p.m., 7 minutes. At first glance, 7 minutes sounds insignificant, but in emergency response analysis, investigators study those moments carefully because they can reveal behavior before panic fully takes over. What did Annie see first? Did she immediately recognize something was wrong? Did she search the property before calling? Did she contact anyone else first? Or was there hesitation because she was trying to understand what she was looking at? Those questions intensified after retired detective Bob Gilliam publicly discussed the sealed recording. In interviews, he suggested investigators may be withholding information intentionally because the call could contain details important to a future prosecution. He also implied the recording might not become public until a possible trial date approaches. That single observation pushed the case into even darker territory, because investigators typically seal evidence for one reason. They believe releasing it publicly could compromise something they are building privately. And then another theory emerged, one that detectives quietly examine in many criminal investigations: the possibility that a caller revealed information they should not have known yet. Experienced homicide investigators often listen to emergency calls for subtle indicators of prior knowledge. Details spoken too early. Descriptions too precise for someone allegedly encountering a scene for the first time. Emotional reactions that don't match discovery patterns. Investigators usually observe that does T automatically indicate guilt. People react unpredictably during trauma. Some become hyper-detailed under stress. Others sound strangely calm. Behavioral analysis alone is never enough, but if detectives believe the 911 call contained guilty knowledge, sealing the recording would suddenly make far more sense. And the public still hasn't heard it. No transcript, no audio. Nothing. Then came the images from Nancy Guthrie's house weeks after the disappearance. Photographs circulated online, showing individuals removing boxes and belongings from the property. Annie's Honda CR-V appeared in some. People were seen carrying items out of the home while the case remained an active federal investigation. That visual hit the public hard because Nancy had not been declared dead. There was no public probate process underway. No announced legal transfer of the property. Officially, she was still a missing person, yet boxes were leaving the house anyway. Maybe there was a completely reasonable explanation. Families often secure valuables during investigations. Attorneys sometimes advise preserving important documents. Personal belongings may need cataloging or relocation for practical reasons outsiders don't understand. But visually, the images created something investigators know can become powerful in public perception. Symbolic evidence, a house that suddenly looked less like a crime scene and more like a transition. And once people saw those photographs, the financial theories surrounding the case accelerated dramatically online. Not because the boxes themselves proved anything, but because they appeared at the exact moment the public was already questioning motive, inheritance, access to property, and the reported loan refusal. The timing amplified everything, and underneath all of it sat the same unresolved mysteries. Why was the CR-V held so long? What exactly was inside the sealed 911 call? What happened during those missing overnight hours between 9:50 p.m. and 12:03 p.m. the next day? And what exactly were investigators trying to reconstruct so carefully behind the scenes? Before we go further, tell me this in the comments. What shocked you most in this timeline? Because by this stage of the investigation, federal agents were no longer just looking at a disappearance. They appeared to be testing a theory. So what exactly were investigators trying to prove? As the public focused on timelines, property records, and sealed evidence, another part of the investigation was unfolding quietly inside forensic laboratories hundreds of miles away. A hair recovered from Nancy Guthrie's home was reportedly sent to the FBI laboratory at Quantico, Virginia. According to public reporting around the case, the sample was also examined through advanced forensic genealogy methods associated with experts like C.C. Moore, whose work has helped identify suspects in cases that remained unsolved for decades. That detail matters because forensic genealogy is designed for a very specific kind of mystery, not strangers hiding in databases. Ordinary people, people with no criminal history, no prior arrests, no fingerprints sitting in law enforcement systems waiting for a match. The kind of individuals who blend naturally into everyday life until one biological trace places them inside an investigation they never expected to face. And according to reports surrounding the case, early database searches connected to the sample did not immediately identify a known offender, which created a chilling implication. If the hair belonged to someone involved, investigators might not be hunting a career criminal at all. They might be looking at someone who appeared completely normal from the outside, someone who attended family dinners, someone trusted, someone already inside Nancy's world. That possibility connects almost every thread in this story. Because from the beginning, this case has never felt centered on chaos or random violence. It feels centered on access. Who could enter Nancy's life without alarming her? Who understood her routines? Who knew the cameras weren't actively monitored? Who knew she removed her hearing aids before bed? Who knew nobody would likely check on her until morning? That's why the financial angle matters so much. Not necessarily because money proves motive, but because proximity to assets often overlaps with proximity to trust. And while investigators continued building their forensic picture privately, another strange detail unfolded publicly. NBC News reportedly established an internal protocol surrounding coverage of the case because Savannah Guthrie, one of Nancy's daughters, was one of the network's most recognizable anchors. According to multiple reports, if major developments occurred live on air, Savannah would be removed from the set and briefed privately before coverage continued. Then in April 2026, viewers noticed something unusual. Savannah teased an upcoming segment during a broadcast, disappeared from the desk shortly afterward, then later returned without explanation. Days later, she was absent again. Now, to be clear, none of that proves criminal involvement by anyone. Networks create contingency plans all the time for deeply personal breaking news involving employees. But the existence of such a protocol suggested something important psychologically. NBC did not appear to believe the case was fading away quietly. They appeared to be preparing for impact. An arrest, a major forensic development, the discovery of remains, something significant enough that executives believed Savannah should not learn about it in real time while sitting live on national television. And then there's the silence surrounding Nancy's son, Cameron. In one of the most publicly discussed missing persons cases in the country, Cameron Guthrie has remained almost entirely absent from public view. No major interviews, no visible press conferences. No strong public social media presence attached to the search for his mother. That silence does not imply wrongdoing. Grief affects people differently. Some family members retreat completely from public attention, especially once intense media scrutiny begins. Attorneys also frequently advise relatives to avoid speaking publicly during active investigations. Still, investigators and audiences alike often notice absence because absence creates unanswered questions. Why stay silent while the world discusses your missing mother every day? What conversations are happening privately that the public never hears? And that's what makes this case feel so psychologically heavy. Nearly every individual detail has a reasonable explanation on its own. A power of attorney can be routine. A loan request can be harmless. A delayed phone call can be forgetfulness. Boxes leaving a home can be practical family management. A sealed 911 recording can simply protect investigative integrity. Individually, none of these things conclusively point anywhere, but collectively they create a pattern investigators clearly believed was serious enough to pursue aggressively. That's the hidden tension underneath the entire case. This may not have begun as a story about violence. It may have begun as a story about vulnerability, about an elderly woman living alone inside a valuable home, about familiarity replacing caution, about opportunity growing quietly over time. Because everyone involved already knew the rhythms of her life. And once investigators started layering the forensic evidence over the emotional and financial timeline, the story became harder to dismiss as coincidence. Because in the end, every thread circles back to the same moment, a reported request, a refusal, a boundary. And in the end, everything comes back to one word. Tonight, Nancy Guthrie's house still sits in the Catalina foothills of Tucson. The same home she lived in for decades. The same quiet streets, the same porch, the same rooms investigators have now searched over and over, looking for something that explains how an 84-year-old woman could seemingly disappear into the night. And somewhere inside the evidence collected from that house is a timeline still being reconstructed piece by piece. The doorbell activity, the vehicle data, the sealed 911 call, the forensic genealogy work happening far from public view. And perhaps most haunting of all, the pacemaker data, a machine inside Nancy's body continuing to record while the outside world lost track of where she was. No arrest has been announced in this case. No one has been formally charged, and right now, investigators may still be trying to answer the same question everyone else has been asking since February 1st. What really happened after Nancy got home that night? But if there's one thing this case has made painfully clear, it's that someone out there almost certainly knows more than they said. Someone knows what happened during those missing hours. Someone knows why the timeline feels incomplete. And somewhere tonight, there is still an empty place where Nancy Guthrie should be. An empty house, an unanswered phone, an empty chair at church that people still notice. If you hope Nancy is found, leave a comment for her family. Some stories end with answers. Others end with silence.